There is a category of evidence in family court proceedings that almost never gets discussed in public spaces. Attorneys pursue it aggressively, judges give it enormous weight, and yet you will not find a single reaction channel, a single commentary page, or a single opinion video covering this specific angle of the Duggar story. That category is medical records. Because here is what most people do not understand. A person's medical history, when examined carefully, tells a story that no social media post, no television appearance, and no carefully rehearsed public statement can ever contradict. And Kendra Duggar has a medical history that raises serious questions that nobody has asked out loud, until right now. If this is your first time on this channel, I want you to hit that like button right now and subscribe, because what we are building here on Jenny Exposes is not reaction content. It is not gossip. It is a complete, documented, multi-layered picture of one of the most complicated family stories unfolding in public life right now. And today we are going somewhere that nobody else has gone. Let's talk about what the body remembers when the voice stays silent. Before we get into the specific theory at the center of this video, I want to establish something important about why medical records matter so much in family court. Because if you don't understand the legal weight of what we're about to discuss, the theory won't land the way it should. When two people are in a legal dispute, whether that involves divorce, custody, asset division, or any combination of those things, both sides are looking for evidence that was created independently. Evidence that was not shaped by one person's memory, not colored by years of retrospective interpretation, and not produced specifically for the purpose of the legal case. The most valuable kind of evidence in any family court proceeding is evidence that was generated at the time something was happening, by a professional who had absolutely no stake in how the legal case would eventually play out. Medical records are exactly that. A physician's clinical notes are created at the moment. They carry a timestamp. They reflect what a trained professional observed, measured, and documented during an actual interaction with a patient. No lawyer shaped those notes. No narrative strategy influenced them. They are, in the language of the courtroom, contemporaneous documentation. And in family proceedings, they can be among the most decisive pieces of evidence that exist. Now, with that foundation in place, let's talk about Kendra. Kendra Caldwell Duggar married Joseph Duggar in September of 2017. She was 19 years old. Within the first 5 years of that marriage, Kendra experienced 4 pregnancies. 4 in under 5 years. And I want to be very specific here, because I am not going to speculate where public documentation already exists. I am going to tell you what is on the record, what was reported, what was broadcast, and what Kendra herself has spoken about publicly, because the public record alone raises questions that deserve serious attention. During her second pregnancy, Kendra Duggar experienced a placental abruption. For anyone who is not familiar with what that means medically, a placental abruption is a condition in which the placenta separates from the inner wall of the uterus before delivery. It is a life-threatening emergency. It deprives the baby of oxygen and nutrients, and it causes severe bleeding in the mother. It is one of the most serious complications that can occur during pregnancy, and it requires immediate medical intervention. Kendra survived it. Her baby survived it. But surviving a placental abruption does not mean the experience left no mark, on the body or anywhere else. What followed that experience was, by public record, a continuation of the same pattern. Subsequent pregnancies came in rapid succession. The physical demands placed on Kendra's body in the years following that near-fatal complication were, by any objective medical standard, significant. And here's the question that I have not heard anyone ask. What does that physical timeline tell us, medically, about the conditions Kendra was living in during those years? This is where science becomes important. And I want to be precise about this because I am not making accusations. I am presenting documented medical research that has been peer-reviewed and published. And then I am holding that research next to what we know about Kendra's documented physical history. And I am asking you to think carefully about what the overlap means. There is an established and extensively researched connection between chronic psychological stress and specific physical health outcomes. This is not fringe theory. This is mainstream medicine. Prolonged exposure to stress, particularly the kind of stress that exists in environments characterized by control, restricted autonomy, and sustained pressure, has documented physical consequences. Elevated cortisol levels, compromised immune function, cardiovascular impact, and in women specifically, documented effects on reproductive health, pregnancy outcomes, and postpartum recovery. The research on this is not ambiguous. The body responds to psychological environments in measurable physical ways, and those physical responses leave traces in blood work, in clinical notes, in the documented observations of medical professionals who were simply doing their jobs. Now hold that framework. Hold it right next to Kendra's documented physical timeline. The placental abruption, the rapid succession of subsequent pregnancies, the physical demands compounding on a young woman's body with what appears, from the outside, to be very little documented recovery time between them. I am not drawing a conclusion for you. I am placing two pieces of documented reality next to each other and asking you to consider what the space between them contains. There is a book you may have heard of called The Body Keeps the Score. It was written by a psychiatrist named Bessel van der Kolk, and it documents with clinical rigor the way that the human body registers and physically records experiences that a person may be socially, psychologically, or circumstantially prevented from expressing verbally. The central finding is this, that the body becomes a document. That when a person cannot speak what they are experiencing for whatever reason, the body speaks it instead. In inflammation, in physical symptoms, in the specific and measurable ways that stress and trauma alter biology over time. The body keeps the score. And in a legal context, the medical record is the scorebook. Here's the theory, and I want you to understand before I state it that everything I am about to say is clearly framed as theory. It is an analytical framework built on documented public facts, established medical science, and a close reading of the known timeline. I am not stating as fact anything that I cannot source. What I am doing is connecting documented dots in a way that nobody else has publicly attempted, and I think that connection is important. The theory is this. At some point in the progression of whatever legal or personal proceedings may be occurring or may have occurred in the lives of Joseph and Kendra Duggar, it is entirely plausible and, in fact, standard legal practice that medical records would have entered the picture, either through subpoena, through voluntary submission, or through the routine processes of family court proceedings. Medical records are routinely introduced in cases involving questions of well-being, stress, and the physical impact of relationship dynamics. And Kendra's medical history, the one we can partially trace through public reporting alone, suggests that within those records, if they exist in a legal context, there may be documentation that tells a story far more precise than any social media post ever could. Think about what clinical notes from the period surrounding her second pregnancy might contain. Think about what a physician's documented observations from her postpartum periods might reflect. Think about what any visit to a medical professional during a period of documented physical stress might have captured in the form of a clinical note. Blood pressure readings, reported symptoms, the physician's own assessment of contributing factors. These are not dramatic revelations. They are routine medical documentation. But in a courtroom, routine medical documentation from a neutral, licensed professional carries extraordinary weight because it was created in the moment, with no legal strategy in mind, by someone whose only job was to observe and record what they saw. Here is what makes this theory particularly compelling when you look at the broader timeline. We know again from public record that Kendra and Joseph maintained a very specific public presentation throughout their marriage. The social media posts projecting happiness, the television appearances, the carefully managed image of a thriving young Duggar couple building a family in the tradition they were raised in. That public presentation is well documented. It exists. And yet, if medical records from the same period contain documentation of stress-related physical presentations, if a physician's clinical notes from the same window of time reflect a different reality than what was being projected publicly, then you have something that is extraordinarily powerful in a legal context. You have a parallel timeline. a documented parallel timeline created by neutral professionals that exists alongside the performed public narrative. And the contrast between those two timelines, the one that was shown to the world and the one that was recorded in clinical notes, is exactly the kind of evidence that changes how a case is understood. This is not speculation for the sake of drama. This is a genuine analytical observation about how family court evidence works, applied to a specific documented situation involving real and publicly known facts about Kendra Duggar's medical history. The placental abruption is on the record. The rapid succession of pregnancies is on the record. The physical demands on her body are a matter of public knowledge. The science connecting chronic stress to physical health outcomes is peer-reviewed and published. The legal framework giving medical records extraordinary evidentiary weight is standard practice. I am not inventing any single piece of this. I am assembling pieces that exist, and I am asking the question that the assembly raises. What do Kendra's medical records, if examined carefully and completely, actually document about her experience during those years? The body keeps the score. And when the person whose body is keeping score has spent years presenting a carefully managed public face that may not have reflected her interior reality, the medical record may be the only place where that interior reality was ever written down honestly. We are going to go deeper on this in the second half of this video. I am going to walk you through the specific legal mechanics of how medical evidence functions in family proceedings, what it would take for records like these to enter the picture, and what the timeline cross-reference, the documented public presentation laid against the documented medical history, might reveal when examined side by side. The picture that emerges is one that I genuinely believe changes how you understand not just Kendra's story, but the entire arc of what has been unfolding in this family. Stay with me. Let me take you inside a courtroom for a moment. Not a real courtroom. I want to be completely transparent with you that what I am about to describe is a dramatized illustration of how this type of evidence functions in a legal proceeding. It is a thought experiment built on real legal mechanics, real evidentiary standards, and real documented facts about Kendra's situation. I am constructing this scene so that you can viscerally understand what it would look and feel like if the theory I laid out in the first half of this video were playing out in an actual proceeding. Because sometimes the clearest way to understand how evidence works is to watch it work. Picture a courtroom, fluorescent light, the particular quiet that exists in legal spaces where serious things are being decided. Kendra is seated at a table. Her attorney has a stack of documents. The opposing counsel has a stack of documents. And the judge, a person who has seen thousands of family cases, who has heard every version of every story that exists in the landscape of domestic legal proceedings, is reviewing something on page 14 of a submitted exhibit. Kendra's attorney addresses the court. Your Honor, I would like to draw the court's attention to a specific clinical notation in the medical records submitted as Exhibit N. Page 14, dated approximately 31 months ago. The judge reviews it, simply said, I see it. And Kendra's attorney continues, the attending physician noted, and I am reading directly from the clinical record, that the patient reported significant and sustained stress of domestic origin, and that this stress was identified by the treating physician as a contributing factor to the physical presentation documented at that visit. The opposing attorney objects immediately. Your Honor, the clinical notation represents the physician's interpretation of a subjective assessment and should be given limited weight. And the judge looks up. And the judge says, it is a licensed physician's contemporaneous clinical documentation, created at the time of the patient interaction, by a trained medical professional with no stake in this proceeding. I give it considerable weight. Continue, counselor. And Kendra, at that table, does not look up, because she already knows what is on page 14. She was there when it was written. She lived the moment that a doctor looked at her, assessed what they saw, and wrote down what they observed. She carried that clinical note in her body for 31 months before it ever entered a courtroom. And now it is Exhibit N. And now it is evidence. And now the parallel timeline, the one that existed underneath the social media posts and the television appearances and the carefully managed public presentation, is a matter of legal record. Now, I want to step back from that dramatization and talk about what it actually illustrates, because the mechanics of what I just described are not fictional. They reflect how this type of evidence genuinely functions. When a physician documents, in a clinical note, that a patient reported stress of domestic origin as a contributing factor to a physical presentation, that notation carries an evidentiary weight that is almost impossible to challenge. Here is why. First, it was created at the time, not retrospectively, not in preparation for legal proceedings. It was created in the moment of the medical interaction, before any legal strategy existed, before any attorney shaped the narrative. Second, it was created by a neutral professional. The physician had no relationship to either party in the legal proceeding beyond their professional duty of care to the patient. Third, it contains a specific timestamp. In legal proceedings, timestamps matter enormously because a timestamp tells you when something was real, not when someone decided to say it was real. And fourth, it reflects the patient's own reported experience, captured in the professional judgment of a trained observer. That combination, contemporaneous, neutral, timestamped, professionally assessed, is the evidentiary gold standard. And the only way it enters a legal proceeding is if it exists in a medical record. Which is why the question of what Kendra's medical records contain is not a trivial one. Let me now talk about the timeline cross-reference, because this is the piece that I think is most important to understand, and it is the piece that nobody discussing this story has publicly assembled. We know from public record that Kendra and Joseph maintained a specific public image throughout their marriage. We have years of documented social media posts. We have television content. We have public appearances and interviews. The public presentation is extensive and well documented. And within that documented public presentation, there is a consistent narrative of a young couple deeply committed to their faith, building a family, projecting an image of contentment and shared purpose. That narrative exists. It was carefully constructed and consistently maintained over a period of years. That is not my characterization. It is simply a description of what was publicly visible. Now, alongside that public timeline, there exists a medical timeline. And the medical timeline does not answer a narrative strategy. It does not project an image. It does not care about how things look. The medical timeline is simply a record of what a body experienced, and when it experienced those things, as documented by the professionals who were present for those experiences. And when you lay those two timelines next to each other, the public presentation timeline and the medical documentation timeline, the question that emerges is whether they tell the same story or different stories. Because if they tell different stories, the divergence between them is not just personally significant. In a legal context, it is forensically significant. It is the kind of divergence that attorneys build entire arguments around, because it speaks to the question of what was real versus what was presented as real. And in family court proceedings, that question is often the central question. Think about the specific periods where the divergence, if it exists, would be most legible. The periods surrounding the placental abruption. A life-threatening medical emergency does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs in the context of a woman's total physical and psychological state. The medical record from that period would reflect not just the emergency itself, but the conditions leading up to it, the blood work, the documented checkups, the clinical observations that preceded the crisis. What do those records say about Kendra's overall physical condition during that pregnancy? What did her physicians observe and document about her stress levels, her reported experience, the context in which her body was functioning? Those are questions that a medical record can answer with a precision that no social media post and no television interview ever could. Think about the postpartum periods. Postpartum recovery is one of the most physically and psychologically demanding experiences a human body undergoes. The documented medical research on postpartum well-being is extensive, and it consistently identifies the conditions surrounding postpartum recovery, access to rest, reduction of ongoing stressors, and the presence of genuine support as critical factors in a woman's recovery trajectory. What do Kendra's postpartum medical records document about her recovery periods? What did physicians observe and note about her condition in the weeks and months following each of her deliveries? Did those records reflect a woman whose recovery was proceeding in conditions of genuine support and reduced stress? Or did they reflect something else? I am not stating an answer, I am stating a question. But it is a question that, in a legal context, a subpoenaed medical record answers with forensic clarity. And here is the layer that I think is the most quietly powerful piece of this entire theory. It is the piece about what Kendra may not have been able to say publicly, but what her body was saying continuously to every medical professional who interacted with her, in every clinical note that was created during those years. We talk about voice. We talk about women in controlling environments not having access to their own voice, not being able to speak their experience openly, not having the social permission or the structural safety to describe what their daily reality actually contains. That is a documented dynamic in a specific category of relationship environment, and the research on it is extensive and credible. But here is what that research also documents: that when the verbal voice is suppressed, the body becomes the voice. Symptoms become communication. Physical presentations become the language that the person cannot speak out loud. And medical professionals, trained to observe and document, become the unwitting transcribers of an experience that was never permitted to be stated directly. If Kendra's verbal account of her experience was, for whatever reason, shaped or constrained by the environment she was living in, if the story she was able to tell publicly was not the full story of what she was living privately, then her medical records may be the only place where the full story was ever written down. Not because she chose to write it there, not because any legal strategy put it there, but because her body wrote it there, in the language of physical symptoms and stress responses, and the honest observations of physicians who were simply doing their jobs. The body keeps the score, and the medical record is the only document that cannot be managed, cannot be edited, and cannot be made to present a narrative that does not reflect physical reality. This is what I mean when I say that the medical angle changes how you understand this entire case. Not because it reveals something sensational, but because it reveals something precise. Medical records, if they exist in a legal context here, do not add drama to Kendra's story. They add timestamps. They add the neutral, professional voice of physicians who had no stake in any outcome. They add a parallel documentation of physical reality that can be cross-referenced against every public appearance, every social media post, and every carefully managed moment of recorded contentment. And that cross-reference, assembled carefully, tells a story with a specificity and a credibility that is almost impossible to argue against in a courtroom. Because you cannot cross-examine a blood pressure reading. You cannot challenge a cortisol level. You cannot discredit a physician's contemporaneous clinical note by questioning their motives, because their only motive was to care for their patient. Now, I want to ask this community something, and I want to ask it genuinely, because what we have built here on this channel is not just an audience. It is a community of people who are paying close attention, thinking critically, and bringing their own knowledge and experience to this story. Many of you have medical backgrounds. Many of you have personal experience with the dynamics we've been discussing across this series. Many of you have sat in a doctor's office and had a physician look at you and see something that you weren't yet ready to say out loud. So here's the question I want you to sit with. If you were the physician who saw Kendra during one of her most difficult periods, if you were the professional who conducted that appointment, reviewed those results, observed her presentation, and then sat down to write your clinical notes, what would you have written? Not a diagnosis, not an accusation. Just what would a careful, observant, compassionate physician have seen? What would they have documented? What would the clinical note from Kendra's hardest day actually say? I want you to drop that in the comments, because this community's ability to hold space for what Kendra may have experienced, to try to see it clearly and honestly, rather than through the lens of either fan loyalty or cynical dismissal, is one of the things that makes this channel different from everything else covering this story. This is not entertainment. This is an attempt to understand a human experience with the seriousness and the precision that it deserves. And the medical angle of the question of what Kendra's body documented during the years when her public voice was telling a specific story is the most serious and precise angle that anyone has applied to this situation. Because it does not rely on interpretation, it does not rely on memory, it does not rely on retrospective accounts shaped by the passage of time and the pressures of an ongoing situation. It relies on contemporaneous documentation created by neutral professionals. And in a world full of competing narratives, contested accounts, and strategically managed public images, that kind of documentation is the closest thing to an objective record of lived experience that exists. I want to say something directly to anyone watching this who has had a similar experience. Anyone who has sat in a doctor's office and had a physician observe something in you that you could not say out loud in any other context. Anyone whose medical record contains a notation that told a more honest story than anything you were able to say publicly during that period of your life. What your body documented is real. What your physician wrote down is real. The fact that you could not speak it elsewhere does not diminish its reality. The body is an honest witness, and sometimes the clinical note is the truest record that exists of what a person actually lived through. Your experience matters. The documentation of it matters. And the fact that it exists, even if nobody sees it, even if it never enters a courtroom, means that your reality was witnessed by a professional, in writing, with a timestamp. That is not nothing. That is, in the most precise sense, evidence. Here is where I want to leave you with this video. Across this series, we have covered the legal architecture of what may be unfolding in the Duggar situation. We have covered the financial structures. We have covered the psychological dynamics. We have covered the public presentation and the questions it raises. And today we covered the medical dimension, the one that nobody else was looking at, the one that operates quietly beneath everything else, the one that may ultimately provide the most precise and most legally powerful documentation of Kendra's experience that exists anywhere. We are building a complete picture, a layered, sourced, carefully assembled picture that treats the story with the analytical seriousness it deserves. And we are nowhere near finished. There is more coming. The picture gets clearer, the timeline gets more specific, and the questions get more important. If this video gave you something to think about, if it opened an angle you had not considered, if it added a layer to your understanding of the situation that you did not have before, then do 3 things right now. Hit the like button, because it tells the algorithm that this kind of serious, substantive content deserves to reach more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because every piece of the series builds on the last, and if you miss an episode, you are missing a piece of the picture. And share this video with someone who is following this story, particularly anyone with a medical or legal background who understands exactly how much weight clinical documentation carries in a family court proceeding. Because those are the people who will understand immediately why this angle matters. The body keeps the score. The medical record keeps the body's score. And on this channel, we keep reading.